For military history geeks like me, this is the sort of story that I find absolutely riveting, and I'm sure you will too. A small group of Europeans and their local allies cut off and surrounded. We'll be meeting a group of roughneck, hard as nails, part-time soldiers known as the Diamond Fields Horse or the Kimberley Horse, and we'll be discovering an almost forgotten European graveyard. This is Lesotho, the beautiful enclave nation inside South Africa. But in 1880 to 81 it was the scene of bitter fighting during the so-called Gun War. In those days it was called Basotho land. And today we're looking at a fascinating battle that took place here at the Hlotse Heights. Now, I've talked about the Gun War before, so I'll keep the background brief. Essentially, it was triggered after a directive was given by the government in the Cape that the Basotho should surrender their guns.
Give them your guns.
Now, like freedom-loving people everywhere, and I know my American friends will empathise, the Basotho liked having guns and being able to protect themselves against tyranny. So as you can imagine, the new law didn't go down very well.
Over my dead body.
Some Basotho agreed to surrender the guns while others refused, and the war kicked off. Okay, enough background, let's get into the fighting. So this structure you're looking at now, surrounded by shops and market stalls in the town of Hhlotse, is called Major Bell's Tower. Who was Major Bell, I hear you cry? Well, Charles Bell was an Indian Mutiny veteran who was an administrator in this remote corner of Africa. When the Gun War broke out in 1880, he was stuck here with 47 other Europeans and 110 loyal Basotho. They were surrounded by a staggering 8,000 enemy Basotho warriors. They'd beaten off a most determined attack on the 8th of November, and since then they'd been in constant action. Bell was later promoted to Lieutenant Colonel while commanding all the troops in the district which is known as Leribe. Clearly an effective commander and a tough lad. While Bell and his lads were busy, the Cape government rushed to raise a new contingent of troops to come to their aid. Who did they turn to? These hardy chaps, the Diamond Fields Horse, aka the Diamond Field Devils. The unit had previously been raised to fight the Hhlotse in the Knife Cape Frontier War, and then in September 1880 they had been renamed as the Kimberley Horse. The regiment was split into two wings, and command of the left wing fell to newly appointed Captain William Lawrence. He was born in Surrey and in 1873 had joined the Commissariat and Transport Department. During the Zulu War of 1879 he was posted to South Africa. However, an injury he sustained at the beginning of the campaign prevented him from seeing any action. He then, after 6 years' service, resigned his commission on the 8th of May 1879 and travelled to Kimberley, where he became the editor of the Diamond News. Then, with the outbreak of war, he had volunteered and been appointed a captain. Lawrence and his men were then ordered to proceed as fast as they could to Maseru, which is today the capital of Lesotho. It was at Maseru on the 11th of November that Lawrence was then promoted to major. That was quick, and ordered to proceed as quickly as possible to reinforce the beleaguered garrison at the Hlotse Heights. It was a long, treacherous journey that involved a wide detour to avoid strong Basotho commandos that controlled the countryside. But on the 15th of November at 6 AM, Lawrence and his men forded the Caledon River and galloped past the Basotho pickets, arriving in Hhlotse. Bell was incredibly relieved to have them and wrote that they fought their way through, having 1 man and 2 horses hit. No sooner had they arrived, they joined up with the loyal chief Jonathan's Basotho levy, who were on the side of the Cape forces, and drove the enemy out of their positions on the south side of the heights. An energetic start. These were lads who liked to get after it. The Kimberley Horse then built a sod wall fort with a gun emplacement about 500 yards northeast of Fort Bell and manned a series of picket posts. The Reverend John Widdicombe of the St Saviour's Mission described one of these posts as, quote, "a hillock renowned as the scene of many a stubborn hand-to-hand fight between the Kimberley Horse and the rebels." Dr. Henry Taylor, who was the sole doctor at Hlotse Heights at the time, got to know Lawrence and his Diamond Field Devils and recorded his own impressions. He said, "Lawrence was a man of peculiarly bright and lovable temperament who speedily won the hearts of those with whom he came into contact, and few men could have better controlled the wild, lawless lot that constituted the bulk of his corps. He always went into action armed only with a little stick, which he used in giving orders to his men. In action he unnecessarily exposed himself, in fact to such an extent that sometimes the thought would cross my mind that he wanted to be killed. More than once I saw him get on his pony and ride alone over to the enemy's lines. He would then ride along the whole of their front, the target of innumerable shots, and finally turning his pony he would ride back again, always untouchable by the volleys fired at him. Balls of steel, that man, especially given that the Basotho were themselves tough as hell and brilliant with their rifles. Very good shots. On the 21st of November, Lawrence with 120 of his men, 40 loyal Basotho police and 30 of a unit called Stanton's Light Horse patrolled out in search of a tough Basotho chief called Joel. Well, they soon encountered a staggering 2,000 Basotho at the foot of a mountain called, wait for it, I've got to psych myself up, Hhlotse. The whites and their local allies dismounted. They fired into the Basotho at 500 yards but couldn't dislodge them. Flankers were sent out and this scattered the Basotho. However, being low on ammunition and sustaining casualties, the patrol retired back to Hlotse, quote, bringing their dead and wounded with them. In November, the garrison received further support, much needed support in fact, when the Transvaal horse under Major Ferreira arrived. This gave the defenders the ability to be more active and to take the war to the Basotho more often. For example, on the 3rd of December, a combined force of 300 men under Major Ferreira were sent out by Bell to search the abandoned villages in the district for firewood. This patrol inevitably encountered a Basotho commando and a bitter fight ensued. There were a number of casualties, but they managed to return with the fuel for the fires, which was important. On the 6th of January 1881, while celebrating the Feast of the Epiphany, another attack was launched against Bell's garrison by several large groups of Basotho. At what was called Kimberley Copy, the picket of the Transvaal horse came under fire and were quick to respond. Ferreira moved most of his men in that direction to support them. Bell then ordered Lawrence and 3 troops of the Kimberley horse to report to Ferreira, but as the Basotho were coming on in large numbers, they were withdrawn back to the camp. The Basotho had within 20 minutes completely surrounded the garrison and captured the houses of Bell and Dr. Taylor that were situated about 400 yards outside the perimeter of the fort. They burned the thatched buildings while the 6-pounder field gun of the Transvaal horse fired case-shot into them. The most determined attack was against Chief Jonathan's loyal Basotho levy. They were commanded by Chief Nathaniel Machloko, who defended his position for 6 long hours. The Basotho were trying to break into the cattle and goat kraals. You have to remember, not only are cattle important for food and milk, but in Africa a man's wealth was and sometimes still is usually judged by his herd. Capturing enemy cattle was very important. At midnight, Lawrence's men counterattacked the Basotho near the Kimberley horse camp. They laid down such a heavy fire that after 30 minutes they couldn't stand it anymore and the Basotho retired. Life at Hhlotse could quickly escalate from mundane routine to a heated fight within minutes. For example, on the 11th of February, Lieutenant Stanley Astley Seymour, formerly of the Merchant Marine, was seriously wounded, as were 5 other men when they were attacked while collecting maize. 3,000 Basotho attacked. A heated engagement took place, with Lieutenant Colonel Bell recording in his dispatches that the Kimberley horse held an advanced position and were hotly engaged for 3 hours when they were brought out of action under Captain Morford. They behaved very gallantly and inflicted considerable loss on the enemy, several of whom fell to the revolvers of officers and men. Another occasion was on the 14th of December 1880 as the night pickets were being changed. Suddenly the Basotho opened up a harassing fire, and when the colonials reinforced the post, the fight escalated and continued for the next few hours. Major Ferreira recalled his men. As soon as this happened though, the Basotho charged in and captured the abandoned post. About 1,000 men were now drawn into the fight. The bulk of the Transvaalers, supported by a 3-pounder field gun, launched a counterattack with Ferreira leading, while the Kimberley horse and Stanton's men were pushed out to support and clear his right flank. After the Basotho had been driven off the kopje and were being followed up, the fighting became so close that they needed to use their pistols. It was then that Captain Oliver William Hanson, a 21-year-old Englishman commanding G Troop of the Transvaal horse, was shot dead. 3 men were wounded, including 1 from the Kimberley horse, while the Basotho lost allegedly between 30 and 40 killed. Hanson's grave is still visible today at the Old Hhlotse Cemetery. On the 9th of March 1881 though, tragedy struck. It was pouring with rain when at 11 a.m. an alarm was raised in the garrison. The Basotho were making away with some of the livestock located near the camp of the Transvaal horse. Ferreira, along with the loyal Basotho levy, pursued them, but they quickly became heavily engaged with one of Joel's commandos. It seemed that the wily Basotho had essentially lured them out into the open for a fight. Bell, seeing more Basotho moving in to join the scrap, ordered Lawrence to reinforce the picket line. Lawrence pushed his men on towards the Hlotse River and took a flat-topped hill nearby. Here Lawrence was standing exposed and directing his men when a bullet struck him in the chest and he fell down mortally wounded. As he was being carried to the rear, he died. Reverend Widdicombe later wrote, "His body was laid on my own mattress in my own hut, and reverently cared for and guarded with a guard of honour until it was buried the next day in the mission cemetery by the side of the others who had fallen in the field. He was beloved and mourned by all, and the whole garrison turned out at the funeral and followed his remains to the grave." His grave still stands there and can be seen today. This is the grave of Major William Lawrence, Major commanding Kimberley Horse. He was a Zulu War veteran. It says here, born at Woking, England, December 22nd, 1855, killed in action by Basothos at Hlotse Heights, March the 9th, 1881. If you're going through the area, please visit. As an aside, while I was in Hhlotse, I met the local administrator, who tells me they're going to be in the process of cleaning up the graveyard and making it more suitable for visitors soon. I hope that works out, and I hope more of you visit. Anyway, back to our story, and with Lawrence now dead, Captain Henry Butler Tomes took command of the Kimberley Horse. The 25-year-old Irishman then managed to disgrace himself and the regiment when he absconded from Hhlotse with a large sum of money. He was soon located and arrested in Cape Town, and after being sent back to Hhlotse, he was tried for embezzlement and sentenced to 18 months imprisonment. He became a school teacher and ended his days in Australia. Sounds about right. Sorry to my Aussie mates, couldn't resist making that joke. The Basotho Gun War ended in April 1881. It had been a tough fight. The Basothos were arguably the toughest enemy the Brits ever met in southern Africa, and that's saying something. This is where the Zulus were, and they remained unbeaten and kept their guns. But despite some rough times and hard fighting, Hhlotse didn't fall, and the small British force could leave with its head held high. As the bulk of the Kimberley Horse were paid off and dispersed, a small contingent volunteered to remain in Basotho land, more or less as a police force. They were commanded by Captain Anson Adolf Meyer, who took the troop down to Maseru, where they built Fort Lawrence, which was named after their late commander. In September 1881, after almost 12 months away, they too returned to Kimberley and were paid off. And what became of Major Bell, the commander? Well, having survived the gun war, he sadly died of bronchitis on the 2nd of July 1881, and is buried close to Lawrence in the old Hlotse cemetery. So this grave is very hard to get close to, this memorial, because of all these thorn bushes. But it is to Major Bell of the Cape Mounted Rifles. The exploits of both sides in this conflict have mostly been forgotten over time. There are only a few paragraphs in the odd book and few histories that touch upon the gun war. Even in Lesotho, not many people know about it, but I think it's an important conflict that both British and the Basotho should remember with pride. I want to say a big thanks to my great mate Cam Simpson for researching and co-writing this episode. I basically lifted the story, with his permission of course, from his new Substack page, which I highly recommend you to check out. You can see it on screen now. The link is camsimpson.substack.com. I'll be back with more fascinating and forgotten stories from British military history next week. In the meantime, YouTube thinks you're going to like this video that's on screen now.